out Psalm 22. That's what I'm doing. Psalm 22. Most of us are probably familiar with it, but I'm going to read a short segment to get us started today. Starting at verse 14. I am poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax. It has melted within me. My strength is dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue clings to my jaw. You have brought me to the dust of death. For dogs have surrounded me. The congregation of the wicked has enclosed me. They pierced my hands and my feet. I can count all my bones. They stare at me. They divide my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots. That psalm was written roughly 500 to 1,000 years before the invention of crucifixion. The entire description of the process was written before it was even invented. What we're going to go through is a little more of a topical study, a little more of an investigation. And like I said, I'm going to get into some details that probably make a few people uncomfortable. But Lord laid it on my heart to try to truly understand the cost. And so, as we go through, I think we're going to go in a chronological approach to this. We'll make references to where the New Testament, namely the Gospels, point out the events that occurred. And the best place to start is before the day of Passover for me. Taking just kind of a short look at who Jesus was as a man before the betrayal, before the Lord's Supper. Just taking into account who he was. He was approximately 30 years old, Jewish male, in the area of Judea and Palestine. Most traditionally, he's seen as a carpenter. There is some evidence that he was just the carpenter's son. He may have been a stonemason, an architect, a craftsman in general. He did a lot of travel. He walked all over the Palestine area that we know of just in the 3 years of ministry. So granted, early 30s, works pretty hard before the invention of power tools. Anyone that's worked in construction, those power drills, those power tools in general make it a lot easier. He didn't have those. So he was a fairly healthy guy. We have no evidence that point that he had any kind of health issues. Then comes the day of Passover. Estimations of the crucifixion was in early April. The Passover would have been roughly April 2nd is when they began preparations. The Gospels tell us the day came, and first thing he does is send out his disciples to go prepare the Passover. On average, people of that region at that time, they were up, if not before sunrise, with sunrise. It's estimated that sunrise was at about 5:30 that morning. We're going to start there. Jesus wakes up. He goes through fairly uneventful, being a religious holiday and him being a famous rabbi. He probably had a busy day. Teaching, getting his disciples together, coordinating everything to prepare for Passover. Busy day, can't say for sure he probably had much of a break that day. Anybody that works in ministry, when the holidays come around, we busy. Very busy people. I don't think that's ever changed. But he has his Passover. Passover dinner comes around. At some point early in that evening, one of his disciples disappears. No one thinks anything of it. Well, he took off. Jesus said some cryptic things that we didn't quite follow, and then Judas took off. The disciples didn't really have much going on, but their minds were a little elsewhere because just before the meal, they were talking about who's the greatest. They seen nothing coming. The Lord led us to the first communion, the Lord's Supper. He instituted it that evening. Even though Jesus had been teaching to them for months, they're going to kill me. They're going to kill me. I'm going to die. I will rise in 3 days. I'm going to die. He has taught them repeatedly leading up to this night. I don't think it quite sunk into the disciples at that point. Here's my body. Here's my blood. This bread is the body broken for you. This blood is what has been spilt out for you. He led them joyously in this, setting up this sacrament, this act that we can use to remember what we do, what he has done for us. With that said, about 7 p.m. is when Judas disappeared. Roughly 10 that evening, Jesus got up and took a nice walk across town to the Garden of Gethsemane. He is here. He brought some of his closest disciples and said, "Stay up and pray for me. Pray with me." And we get a picture of the most intense prayer you'll probably ever read about. It's all sinking in. It's all coming down now. The pressure is on. This is the moment of truth. And his closest friends can't even stay up to pray with him. Jesus is under so much stress that he's literally praying for the reason he came to earth not to happen. He doesn't want to face it, but he also does want to face it. I think we've all been in a situation. We don't want to do this, but we need to do it. It needs to be done. This level of stress leads to one of the first wounds we want to discuss. One of the first medical conditions Jesus faced that night. And that is, forgive me, it's been a while since I've regularly used medical terminology, but I'm doing my best today. Hemohydrosis. This is where the body is under so much stress, the capillaries in the scalp and forehead burst, mixing your sweat with blood. It's a very rare situation. It doesn't happen all that often, but the primary cause is stress levels that could lead to a stroke. So putting ourselves in the mindset of Christ at this moment. You know you're about to face one of the most excruciating ways to die. It is for the sake of the entire world, both past, present, and future. You're going to pay the penalty. The wrath of God will be upon you for the sins of the world. And all you've asked thus far is, if there's any other way, let's go that route. And you've asked your closest friends to pray for you, and they fell asleep. And one of them is out selling you out right now so that this process can get started. Emotionally, mentally, and physically, Jesus is under a lot of stress. He's been up all day. It is now 10 o'clock at night. He got up at approximately 5 o'clock that morning. He's been working all day, teaching and ministering. And the estimated temperature of that night was close to freezing. The estimated temperature, April 2nd, 33 AD, by meteorologists would have put it at roughly 34 degrees. So he's cold. He's out in the garden. He's sweating to death because he's under stress. He's bleeding because he's under so much stress. And he can't get his buddies to back him at all right now. And his night's only going to get worse. If you're wanting references to some of these, I'm going to try to remember to point out where in the Gospels these things happen. Luke 22 describes where he's in the garden and he's sweating blood. Approximately midnight, Judas, who would later be given the surname Iscariot, is meeting with the temple guards and Caiaphas and Annas. He has just sold out that he will take the temple guards and Roman soldiers to where Jesus is and identify him. He receives 30 pieces of silver for his troubles and begins to lead the guard. Between 12 and 1, he arrives, tells the guards, "I will walk up and kiss my master. That's the one you want to arrest." He walks up to him, gives him a kiss, a greeting kiss, which was customary at that time. Guards immediately arrest him, and it is stated that he receives beatings and mocking until time for his first trial of the evening. That's right. There was many, many trials. This is where things get a little bit hard to describe if you have no way to relate to it, but I'm going to do my best. Anybody that's ever been in a physical altercation, namely a fist fight, whether voluntary or involuntary, I don't really need the details, but there is a big difference in taking a strike that you're ready for and one you don't see coming. The body will naturally react, tense up, prepare to be struck if it knows it's coming. Anybody that's been hit by somebody knows when you see it coming, it doesn't hurt nearly as bad as when you're blindsided. Part of this mocking, as we read in the Gospels, also stated in Luke 22, it's roughly verse 60, 63. Jesus is blindfolded or placed a bag over his head. He's blinded in some way. And the temple guards strike him. Then say, "Prophesy, teacher. Which one just hit you?" Not being ready, there's probably some serious complications to this, if not rendered near unconscious from being hit repeatedly. You got to remember these are religious guards who think they've just caught a blasphemer. The blood's pumping. I'm sure they weren't very mindful of how badly they were hitting him. 1 a.m. Jesus is taken to his first trial. This is with Annas before he is actually taken to Caiaphas, the high priest of that year. He stands trial, and basically they ask, are you the Messiah? Are you God in the flesh? He says, it is as you say it is. We need to hear nothing else. Put him to death. Few things wrong with this night. One, the trial's at night. That's against the law. Two, the Jews are under Roman authority. They don't have the authority to put someone to death. Well, fine. He's held till 5 a.m. under temple guard to his second trial. This one's a little more illegal because it's during the day at the temple. Estimated about 5 a.m. he faces his second trial. Pretty much goes the same way. People shout a whole bunch of stuff, but none of the stories are lining up. But all the high priest heard is, this guy thinks he's the Messiah. So they want him put to death. Once again, they don't have the authority to put someone to death because of the Roman law. All this said, Jesus has been awake for almost 24 hours. He's been beaten by guards, abandoned by those closest to him, and is now being held in shackles, already knowing how this is going to end. Just trying to place throughout studying this and preparing this, I tried to keep my mind where I think Jesus would have been. It's hard to do. Because the entire point of the Christian walk is to try to be more like him. But through trials that I've faced in my life, I tried to be where he's at. Abandoned, beaten, exhausted, freezing. I can somewhat relate. I've been at that point at some point in my life, not to this extent. But then things continue on. Approximately 6 a.m. The first actual legal trial begins. Trial number 3 before Pontius Pilate. Goes before Pontius Pilate, and to top off the levels of legal troubles that there are in all this process, he's brought before Pilate under totally different charges than what he was convicted of by the temple. The temple wants him dead because he claims to be the Messiah. But that ain't going to get him killed by the Romans. The Romans don't care about any Messiah. So they change the charges. Oh, honorable and gracious, powerful Pilate, we have a criminal here for you who claims to be the king here to take over your Roman Empire. He's here to overthrow you. We bring this traitor to you. I mean, what you guys were talking about just an hour ago at the temple. Pilate says, okay, bring him here. Interviews him. Brings him back out. I don't find anything wrong with this guy. But he needs to be put to death. He's a traitor. He ain't a traitor. We want him dead. Well, take him to Herod. They pack him up, take him to Herod. Long story short, take him back to Pilate. Back to Pilate. Jesus has walked 3 miles in just 3 trials, going back and forth trying to find somebody. They'll either set him free or kill him. Pilate finally has enough. Here's a horrible murderer. All kinds of trials that we were getting ready to crucify this morning, or here's your King of the Jews. Which one you want? I'll release one since it's the Passover. Release the murderer. Seriously? You want the murderer? Or the crazy prophet that thinks he's your Messiah? Release the murderer. Well, what am I doing with him? Crucify him. Gospels tell us the crowd began to chant, crucify him. Pilate knew this wasn't right. He didn't want to do it. But years before even Christ's birth, there was something called the Maccabean Wars. Basically an uprising of the Jews. To not get into too many details. Which doesn't look good to Caesar when his appointed officials can't keep people in line. What Pilate saw was another uprising if he didn't do something. So Pilate washes his hands of the issue and says, do what you will with him. And sends Jesus to be scourged. Matthew 27 gives a pretty decent description of what goes on. But this is the part that I felt led to really dig into. What is scourging? What is the whole process? Well, if I can find the image here, never mind. Of course, the one picture I want to jump to didn't load up right. Scourging. Scourging is a process that was almost exclusively meant for the vilest of criminals. It was a standard practice before someone is crucified. And Jesus was about to face what the maximum penalty was. Jewish law wouldn't allow more than 39 lashes because it was thought that if you went to 40, you guaranteed to kill the man. It was customarily done with what is known generally as a scourge or a cat of 9 tails. It is essentially a wooden handle with 9 leather straps. At the end of those straps would be some kind of stone or metal balls. And about 3 inches from the very tip would be metal hooks, shattered bone, quite literally anything that would dig in. Anybody been fishing and mishandled that hook in any way? That much hurts. Now imagine there is no patience getting it back out. It's essentially what it is across the entire backside of a man who has been tied to a post with his arms above his head. He would be struck by 2 Roman guards, one coming from each side. From top down would be the lashings. This would strike every inch of the backside, from shoulders to about the back of the knee, roughly, was the target area. 9 hooks striking you 39 times, with enough force that a well-seasoned scourger could cleanly skin somebody's backside completely off. If he got a little too carried away, those hooks and balls would dig below the skin level into the muscle tissue and rip the muscles, causing lesions and basically shredding whatever they got a hold of. This would be done 39 times, or if the person passed out beforehand, because it wasn't meant to kill. It just meant to cause a lot of damage and a lot of bleeding, namely in the form of crucifixion, to make sure he was good and weak, so that the crucifixion process would be more excruciating. And we'll get into how that all ties in a moment. After scourging, he was mocked again by the Roman soldiers. They placed a purple cloak and a crown of thorns on his head. This isn't a rose bush. These were roughly 1-inch long thorns, made into a circlet like a crown and forcefully pried onto his head. Generally, if they were mocking someone that thought they were a leader, they would take the thorns and then take some kind of piece of wood and drive it in, possibly piercing into the skull. They mocked him, spat upon him, beat him with what they were going to then turn around and give to him as a scepter, and led him to parade him before his accusers. Beaten to the point where he likely could not open his eyes, jaw swollen to the point where he probably can't move it, bleeding from his forehead, fresh open wounds. Now the blood is coagulating with the robe that he is wearing. He is presented before the Jews. Pilate once again saying, "There, is that enough? Crucify him." The bloodlust was real. A man who hardly resembles a human being at this point, they want more. So, he is prepared for crucifixion. What this means is that now robe that is probably feels like it's part of his skin at this point, since there is nothing between his muscle tissue and the fibers, is ripped off of him, reopening all the wounds. It is still early in the morning and cool, so it's no more than roughly 42 to 46 degrees. He is stripped down to nothing but a simple undergarment to cover his genitalia, because Jewish law did not allow a man to be exposed completely on the cross. He is then given the crossbeam of the church, or of the cross, the horizontal portion of it. This thing weighs between 75 to 120 pounds. It is strapped to his bare shoulders. Bare meaning no flesh left, really. Jesus has been awake for 26 hours at this point. 26 to 28 hours. Freezing, abandoned, beaten, and then likely suffering the symptoms of hypovolemia, loss of blood. If he wasn't already tired, he can't hardly stay awake at this point anyway, because he doesn't have blood circulating through his body. Exposed wounds are now being filled with dust and whatever the crowds are throwing at him, because it was a form of entertainment to mock and throw things at the criminals that are going to face their fate. He now needs to walk quarter to half a mile to Calvary. Gospels tell us that he couldn't do it. He couldn't make it. Falls before him, and another man has to pick up and carry his cross, which further supports Christ's blood pressure couldn't be more than 60 systolic. That's the top number. That's just enough to stay conscious. I don't know if you guys can see that. That didn't come up quite as bold as I would like. Yep, that's not going to work. But right there, roughly, is where his trial was. Two possible paths were that or along the wall. Estimated to be about quarter to half a mile. He's paraded through one of the main, basically near one of the main thoroughfares, the military and commercial districts of Jerusalem at that time. It was likely a madhouse. Both between people that just like to watch horrible things happen. We all have watched horror movies or UFC fights. It's still in our blood to this day. We like to see a little bit of violence. Or people that are outraged that we would dare have a crucifixion on Passover. So you got a lot of angry people. He's paraded through until he reached Calvary. Will you stop writing? Thank you. What we see here is the likely cross that Jesus would have faced. It would have stood roughly 10 feet from top to bottom. If you look at the middle section there, this portion, in all my readings, I cannot find any time that little footrest was used before 200 AD. So most depictions where Jesus has something to stand on, if you've ever seen those kind of pictures in crucifixions, didn't exist yet. The Romans, though they did not invent crucifixion, that was the handiwork of the Persians, they didn't invent it, but by God, they perfected it. Chief executioners for crucifixions were not seen as merely soldiers with a profession. They were seen as artists. A well-trained executioner in crucifixion could keep that man alive as long as you would like. Because as I stated at the start, crucifixion was an execution process. It was a torture. Death was just a byproduct at the end. Jesus would have been required, strapped, as you can see up there, to carry the top portion of the cross. A sign, which is usually depicted as being hung at the end of, after he's up on the cross, that was actually hanging around his neck. Because the whole point is, this is why this is happening to this man. This was the purpose of the entire process was to deter anybody else from committing the same crime. He was being made an example. So here is Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. That would have sunk into everybody. You don't have a king. You have a Caesar. You are Roman citizens or subjects, not even citizens. You are subjects. The point the Romans were trying to make is don't rise up against Rome. But to the Jews, it was, this guy thinks he's our Messiah. This is what blasphemers get. But we know in the after fact, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews, or more accurately, the Christ, it was letting everybody know this is the price. Yeah, you're going to have to forgive me. A lot of the examples I had to make this a little clearer aren't coming up, but some of you guys are like, thank goodness. The process of crucifixion, when we say that his hands were pierced, is often a misunderstanding or a mistranslation. Customarily, well, today we have distinctions. You have a hand, you have a wrist, you have a forearm. Back then, wrist, hand, anything that was manipulated at the very end of your arm, that was all a hand. The Roman executioners were very intelligent men. Often when we think of these guys that were crucifying him, we picture these like barbaric guys joking and laughing and kind of halfway doing just day-to-day job. No, these guys were artists. They took pride in their craft. And part of that was knowing exactly where to drive this 8-inch railroad spike of a nail through the wrist, avoiding breaking bone, avoiding breaking arteries and veins, but nailing that nerve dead on. The nerve that they struck would essentially paralyze the hand into a claw. It would shrink up and be locked in this way. It's in between the bones and the joints just enough that it could actually support the weight of the body without causing any more bleeding. The crucifixion itself was actually a fairly bloodless act. It was beforehand where all the blood came from. Yes, there would be some bleeding from driving a nail into your hand, but they did it in such a way that it wasn't going to cause death, it was just going to cause some pain. Striking that nerve, you've lost the use of your hand, which was one of the things that stood out. I may be digging too deep into this, but he lost the use of his hands. There was no more work to be done. The work was being completed at that moment. Once nailed to the cross, he would then be moved to the upright. The upright attached to the crossbeam. Then, setting his knees just at enough of a bend, as you can see in the picture here, his feet were nailed through. Once again, this target was very precise. Between the bones that lead from the base of your foot up into your toes, struck right through, avoiding all blood vessels, but still, once again, striking the main nerve that leads into each foot. This was attached, both feet with one nail, into the cross, with a bend at his knees that would play into the torture later. Cross is then raised, dropped into a 3 to 4 foot hole, jolting the body to the point where you likely have dislocated the shoulders. He is now hanging, arms outstretched, being completely supported by severed nerves in hands and feet. The pain, I can only imagine, is to the point you don't want to scream because you're afraid it's going to hurt more. The only way he can now breathe, as you can see in this image here, his weight is pressing into his diaphragm and into his lungs. You have to be able to move your diaphragm to breathe. You cannot do this being hung like so. The only way to do this is to physically lift your body up and down to take breaths. So you have to press on the nails piercing your feet and hands. Raising yourself up, taking half the breathing process, going back down to complete the other half of the breathing process. You repeatedly do this if you want to continue to breathe. Fun story, we have no control over that as human beings. We have to. It's embedded into us. It's an automatic response. When you stop breathing, all you want to do is continue breathing. You can't force yourself to do it. Your body will shut yourself down and make you breathe if you try to stop yourself. So every time he spoke on the cross, every time he wanted to take a breath, it was raise yourself up on the open wounds on your back, ripping them open against this raw wood. Reopening each one every time you wanted the release of breath. Once he's hung on the cross, they offered him a drink. It is essentially a wine vinegar-esque mixture, which also served as a painkiller. Why would they be giving him a painkiller? They want him to hang longer. Remove some of the pain so maybe he'll stay up there longer. The whole purpose was to cause as much excruciation. The Latin root word where we get excruciation or excruciating actually means from cross. Our term, excruciating pain, comes from crucifixion. Jesus refused this. I think it was twofold. One, the purpose to pay for sins. He's going to suffer the entire ordeal. Two, the completion of the psalm we opened with. My mouth is dry, my tongue sticks to the roof of my mouth. His hands and feet are pierced. Jesus would be up there roughly 4 hours. He makes several statements throughout the process. He's been dragged around in his trials for almost 4 miles, 33 and a half hours awake, beaten, torn apart, bleeding out, hypovolemic to the point of barely conscious, hung on a cross where he has to put himself through torture just to take a breath. For 4 hours he's up there killing himself just to breathe. All the while he looks down and people mock him, basically ridicule him for everything he ever tries to say on the cross. He looks down and there's not even any reverence to the fact that he's up there. The guards are gambling for what's left of his clothing. Freezing, ashamed, abandoned. If that isn't suffering enough, 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 24 implies a simple fact. The level of torture and pain was for the sin of the world. The wrath of God. Payment for every wrongdoing humanity has done, past, present, and future. Then comes what is likely the biggest medical marvel that I had digging through this. It is rare and honestly hard to believe and wrap my head around. I have some medical knowledge. Even the doctors that I was reading their research papers on this were like, it's the only explanation for what happens. It's the only way it could happen. It's unlikely, it's hard to believe, but It's what happened. The Gospels and the accounts of both secular, Roman, Jewish accounts, not just in the Gospels, everything that references this execution has one key note that blew the minds of all those that wrote it. Even Pontius Pilate couldn't quite understand how Jesus only lasted 4 hours. Surely a healthy guy like that could have lasted longer than that. But Jesus did something that threw everybody off. He takes a breath and shouts, "It is finished." And it says he let his spirit go. Now, anybody that's dying of blood loss or exhaustion, they don't have energy. They kind of just go. 1 minute they're there, the next they're gone. Jesus let out a powerful shout, "It is finished." And then he immediately was dead. He slumps over and he's gone. As Roman historians stated, he let out a shout that was greater than any war cry that is ever heard on the battlefield. And then there was nothing. I want to read a statement that is the likely cause of death of Jesus Christ. Most would think he's been bleeding for hours. Others would say it's a combination of everything that's been going on with him. Final cause of death, cardiac rupture. Most people would say, well, yeah, he was stabbed in the heart with a spear afterwards, right? Coagulated state, non-infective thrombotic vegetation would have formed in the aortic and mitral valves. These then could have dislodged, causing embolism, coronary circulation, and thereby produced an acute transmural myocardial infarction. Thrombotic valvular vegetation reported developed under an analogous acute traumatic condition. Rupture of the left ventricle free wall may occur through uncommonly in the first few hours following infarction. That is a big medical statement saying his heart broke. Blood flow led to coagulation, which would have led to an embolism causing a heart attack, and then rupturing the valve of his heart. Jesus didn't die because he was stabbed. He didn't die because he was beaten, flogged, scourged, dragged across the city for 6 miles, left awake for 34 hours straight. He died of a broken heart. They then, just to make sure he died, a Roman soldier took his spear, roughly 7 feet long, stabbed him in the heart, confirming the left ventricle tear that we just stated because water and blood poured out. It was cardiac pleural areas, fluid had settled at the bottom of his chest cavity and poured out when they struck him from the right side through the ribs, just as any good, well-trained soldier would have done. He didn't flinch. Water and blood poured out. He is then released to his family. All this isn't to confirm that Jesus did die. This isn't to confirm that it did happen. As much people want to say Jesus never existed, I'm sorry, the historical documents that I personally have read state there was a Jesus from the city of Nazareth at 30 AD was sentenced to death by Pontius Pilate of the Roman authority under Caesar. He was confirmed dead after 4 hours, reconfirmed dead before release by stabbing into the right side of the chest, and released to family and friends. That is the Roman record from 40 AD, discovered in 1943. But none of it matters because there's not a body to do an autopsy. 3 days later, after being under Roman guard, there's no body left. Jesus suffered what I, as an EMT who has seen some horrible things in my time, I'm sure Mike back there as a paramedic has seen some horrible things in his years, was left awake at night after really digging into this. I've lost sleep just thinking about what I've read. I can't imagine it. I can't imagine anybody even making it to Calvary after what he suffered. But he suffered. And 34 hours before pronounced dead, he was getting ready for a holiday with his buddies. 12 hours later, he's joyously telling them, I'm going to die, and I want you guys to do this in remembrance of what I'm about to do, guys. This is it. Redemption is coming. He was excited. When reality set in, he didn't give up. He continued on. He was the Messiah. He was God in the flesh. At any point, he could have said, no, we're not doing this. He laid down his life. It was voluntary. He feared it. He was a human being. He feared what he was about to go through, but he knew it was necessary. The wrath of God for the sins of all humanity, past, present, future, had to be poured out, had to be paid for. He suffered all the things that I've just spent close to an hour discussing as payment, as retribution, as redemption. And in the end, no Roman guard, no Jewish temple guard, no human being killed him. Nobody killed him. The sins of the world killed him. He died of a broken heart failure, ruptured ventricle, and a heart attack. His heart broke. Final cause of death.